Okay, it is 5:30. This is a joint meeting of the Water Quality Management Committee and the Board of Health. We asked the Board of Health to meet with us so we can let them know what we've been looking at and working on, hear a little bit more from them about where they're at with their regulations that impact the nitrogen reduction. I think it's probably appropriate just for procedural purposes. I'm calling the meeting to order for the Water Quality Management Committee.
And I'm calling the meeting to order for the Board of Health.
Thank you.
And I don't know if this is working or not. Maybe.
All right. And I will take 1 minute to acknowledge there's many people in the audience tonight, more so than usual. But I do believe we have at least 2 members of the Select Board here, which is good. And then we have 2 members of the Pond Committee here as well. And the rest of you are here as generally private citizens or representing certain groups and interests. With that, what I'd like to do, if I can, is just sort of present a little bit of where this committee's at and where we're going. I will go to the lectern. Kristen, do we have a couple of slides?
Even have paper. You even have paper.
So, to the 2 members of the Board of Selectmen that are here, the Water Quality Management Committee is very much aware that we're an advisory committee to the Select Board. We've spent a considerable amount of time over the last 6 months or longer looking at watershed by watershed for the nitrogen impaired areas, what the sort of outline of a watershed plan might be. We are working towards a presentation to the Select Board, probably February, possibly early March, where we will talk about what we're doing and provide an outline and recommendation on where to go with the watershed planning. Today I sent to the town manager's office a charging document because our original charging document from 2011 says that we're to work on helping with the Comprehensive Wastewater Management Plan and alternative technologies to see if there's a way to reduce areas to be sewered. Well, clearly since that time with the watershed plan and permit process developing, what we're doing is much different than before. So probably in the near future, the Select Board will see a proposed updated charging document that we spent the better part of our last meeting putting together. So just to help everybody out, this is a map of Falmouth's watersheds. The red lines obviously represent the corporate boundaries of Falmouth and Mashpee and Bourne. And as you can see, there are multiple watersheds there. This is now a more color-coded map, and what we've done here, again, for the benefit of everybody in tonight's discussion, is we've put numbers on there, B representing Buzzards Bay, S representing the Sound, and we've numbered them. And just to run from the top to the bottom so we all know what we've got. The Mgmt Harbor watershed is in an NSA. Rand's Canal, B2, is in an NSA. Fiddler's Cove is in an NSA. Wild Harbor. Herring Brook is not in an NSA. West Falmouth Harbor is. Great Sippowisset Creek has no designation. Little Sippowisset Marsh has no designation. B9 is a direct discharge. We're moving now down onto the bottom end of the moraine, heading down to Woods Hole. B10 is Quisset Harbor. Then as you come around to the other side, you pick up Oyster Pond, which has got a NSA designation. Salt Pond does not. There is a small direct discharge, S3. S4 is Falmouth Inner Harbor, which does have an NSA designation, Little Pond, Great Pond, Green Pond, Bourne's Pond, and Eel Pond and Wacoit Bay have that NSA designation. The area in red here, I guess that's red, maroon, whatever that is. So those are the NSA designated watersheds. Question that came up, I think, in the past, how many of the ponds are in the NSA areas? So to the extent that watershed planning puts together things having to do what homeowners can and can't do in the watersheds, whether it's an advanced treatment system or they get on a sewer. At least 67 of the 78 ponds in town are within nitrogen-sensitive areas. This last slide is sort of where we've gotten to a little bit. This is zoomed out a little bit so you can see all of the Woods Hole end of the moraine. Again, those areas are not in an NSA designated area. The map shows the existing sewer service areas. I guess that color is pink. The planned sewer area on here represents the areas that, the Tasser area, where we're sort of marching forward already. And then, based upon the Comprehensive Wastewater Management Plan adopted 15 years ago now? It was a draft one, so it's been out for 10 or 12 years, I think. Yeah.
2012.
And so then there's some proposed sewer areas. And then the area in light blue, I hope you can distinguish that, as this committee's technical consultant and the board looked at things, we identified the extent to which if we use 10 milligrams per liter for performance of an advanced treatment system, the extent to which, if nothing else, gets modified or changed through the watershed planning process, sort of, if you will, the maximum extent to which we would have to designate areas that alternative systems go into. As you can see, there's a couple of watersheds where we identified that virtually every property in that watershed would have to either be on a sewer or have an advanced treatment system. The last thing I've got here, to the extent that people want to, as we talk about things, move back and forth between any of the maps or whatnot, I handed out to all of the folks sitting here representing the two boards a hard copy of this. This is a little bit difficult to absorb immediately, but we're in 2025 right now at the start. There's roughly a 7-year period to develop, submit, and to be issued a watershed permit from the DEP. We did apply for a notice of intent, and those were accepted. And we identified that we would do 4 different groups of watershed plans, one in 2027, one in 2028, one in 2029, and one in 2030. Part of that is to break up the work of preparing, but more importantly, since once a watershed plan is accepted by the DEP, it starts a clock of which every 5 years you have to do a progress report. That's the bottom line down there, which talks about annual water quality monitoring, a progress report, and to the extent that we don't make the progress in the plan that we hope to have, we have to come back with how we're going to get back on track with that plan. So if you think about this, if we did all of the watershed permits in 1 year, applications for them, there'd be an awful lot of work every 5 years to gather all that information for each watershed. So we've spread it out to make it a little bit more manageable in terms of gathering the information, getting the data and submitting it. I won't be around in 2050. But that is, if you go to the 2030 watershed permit group, Quistit Harbor, Mgmt Harbor, Wild Harbor, you know, the group out there at the 2030 point, you know, that 20 years to implement the watershed permit plan takes you out to the year 2050. So this is a long timeline. However, one of the reasons to sit down with the Board of Health, and I thank you for agreeing to do this with our board, is as this board marches forward and makes some suggestions and recommendations to the select board, one of the key things is going to be how, as we develop watershed plans, do we implement the areas in which advanced treatment is going to be needed, you know? Does that go through the Board of Health, who has the authority to issue things that are for public health? Does that go as an informational element to town meeting? We're not fixed on that, and that, just to give you a hint, when we come in before the select board will be probably the item that we are looking to hear from you and get feedback if you want to do planning overlay districts or how you want to go about doing that over the time. And this board, I think, is committed to helping with whatever path we decide to do, to be ready to say that as we put our plans in, this is how we're going to implement it. But a big portion of tonight, I hope, is a conversation. We have seen, Jed, I think you put together 4 or 5 versions of the regulation that the Board of Health has been looking at to add to the home petition. How do you refer to it? The 15 paragraphs that you...
Home rule.
Home rule.
It's home rule.
Right.
You guys have been wrestling with and are, I think, making excellent progress towards a home rule petition that would apply to certain specific situations from the time you decide to implement that home rule regulation until we get to the point where watershed plans are accepted by the DEP and we take the bigger package to the town, okay? Any questions from any board, either one of the boards, on what we've done so far? George?
Yeah, the designation, no designation versus no NSA. No NSA, it's been determined that it is not a sensitive area, or that it just hasn't been looked at, or it's not an official NSA by DEP regulation.
So Herring Brook, the state has indicated that it's impaired. The town did a study on Herring Brook and indicated that it wasn't impaired. So there's some disagreement between whatever the state did in the past and now. But there is no TMDL, and so therefore it's not an NSA. And so I did distinguish that from the ones where there's no designation and there's no indication from this, at any level on the state, that they're impaired or not. So particularly as you get down into Woods Hole, you know, those watersheds are going out to the ocean, the bay, okay? Did I answer your question?
Yes.
The good doctor.
I didn't understand your answer. That is to say, anything that says no designation just means there's no disagreement about the designation, whereas not an NSA is the town and the state disagree. I just want to be real specific about those because I don't.
On Herring Brook, I wouldn't characterize it that the town and the state disagree, okay? The state at one point indicated that Herring Brook was impaired. When the town, momentarily I can't remember the impetus for this, but there was a question on Herring Brook. And so the town contracted with, in essence, some of the people that did the MEP reports to evaluate Herring Brook relative to the fact that beds 14 and 15 discharged through Crocker Pond and down towards Herring Brook, and whether or not there were issues there or not. And the result of that report was that relative to the amount of nitrogen that was going to be developed at those beds, that it was not going to be an issue for the marsh, because the marsh had capacity for nitrogen. So I would say the town's done additional evaluation beyond what was done by the state, specific to some additional nitrogen loadings in that area.
And to further answer Dr. George's question.
Just George.
No, but there's another George, so what am I going to do? So no designation indicates that it does not discharge, the groundwater does not discharge into an enclosed estuary, but instead directly to sound or bay.
I would
Is
say
that
for
wrong?
Great Sippawishit Creek and Little Sippawishit Marsh, that's not entirely
That's true.
good description of those
Right.
two locations. But, for example, if you go down to Oyster Pond, or I'm just gonna scroll down here again to help delineate that, these areas are all draining not to a creek or an estuary, but are draining to the Sound or Buzzards Bay directly.
Yeah, okay. And the Sippawisset, simply because they're more marsh than estuary, or what?
Yeah. I would presume that's what it is. Again, I can't speak to back when the MEP study was originally set up and done, how they eventually chose which ones were, quote, estuaries and would fall under their review. But having sat through your meeting on Monday night a week ago, I thought this graphic would be helpful, and by putting some numbers to the different watersheds, as you're considering what you're looking at, you can wrestle with whether you want it to be for the entire town. And I guess I've jumped ahead here a little bit. Perhaps maybe Jed or somebody could, walk through what you've got for a regulation and what you're considering for different things.
Yeah, so the Board of Health has, over the last few years, has been gradually increasing the level of regulation on IA systems. Years ago, when I first came to the board, we required collection of data, but there was no real requirement that an IA system meet the mandated, quote, mandated nitrogen levels in the effluent. There was a period of time when IAs were being improved and data needed to be collected to help with improvement of the technology. At this point, there are technologies that can get quite low nitrogen levels, 10, 11, 12 milligrams per liter total nitrogen. We're making efforts to more strictly require that IA systems meet the designated levels when they're permitted. And what we're discussing right now are the possibility of updating our local regulation to require installation of IA systems with new construction or with major renovation of homes. With the idea being that we have a lot of nitrogen in the environment now. We know it's going to be very expensive and difficult to remediate. Making the problem worse over the next 30 years on Steve's timeline here out to 2050 will only make the problem more difficult to remediate. So if we can reduce the amount of nitrogen, the new nitrogen that's going into the watersheds through this path, that's the effort. Jed, do you want to talk about some of the decision points that are reflected in the scenarios that you've written up?
Right. So initially, we leaned on the sort of the version 1, which is, I hope, before you, is leaning on the definitions in Title 5, which is 310 CMR 15, to give it its full name, which designates nitrogen-sensitive areas, which, of course, is what you've just described, and gives a map lookup for individual addresses. And the revisions that were promulgated in 2023 also incorporated the requirement to incorporate best available nitrogen-reducing technology, which will, at present, we believe will meet the 10 milligrams per liter level that's in the modeling right now. In fact, there's reasonable data to suggest it's actually slightly better than that. And we focused it specifically on nitrogen-sensitive areas to follow Title V. And then we also added to follow a requirement for substantial buildings undergoing substantial improvement in nitrogen-sensitive areas. We added in the requirement to incorporate an IA into the system. Then there was additional discussion to add nitrogen-impaired watersheds as well as nitrogen-sensitive, with the recognition that by allowing continued new construction in a nitrogen-impaired area, it will likely progress towards a nitrogen-sensitive area. And that was version 2 in your packet. Version 3 essentially expands it to all of Falmouth, with the recognition, as if you look at this map, the vast majority of Falmouth falls into an actual nitrogen-sensitive, formal nitrogen-sensitive area, and most likely nitrogen-impaired area. Recognizing that the Sippowisset, Great Sippowisset, and Little Sippowisset marshes simply haven't been evaluated for nitrogen sensitivity for whatever reason. And then the last one adds in essentially a credit for installation of the best available nitrogen-reducing technology, recognizing that the life of a system is about 30 years, we think, and not requiring someone to connect to the sewer if they have already, because of this regulation, installed an IA system, not requiring them immediately, giving them some period of time. I put in 15 years because that's the time that some other towns have established. So that's sort of the summary of the differences on these. I think the main thing is the difference between putting it into requiring it only in a nitrogen-sensitive area, and recognizing that most of Falmouth contributes to the nitrogen-sensitive areas, and that it makes the broadest sense to think of it in that context, or at least certainly discuss it in that context. Does that satisfy? Is that in accordance with the board feels?
Yeah, go ahead, George.
Well, I'd just like to add that the biggest challenge of the Board of Health is that as the town proceeds in deciding where sewer will be, and the uncertainties that go with that, and some of the certainties that do go with that, we're trying to figure out what the best and most equitable way to introduce this is. Because if we require an IA system in an area that all of a sudden, because of a new development in the wastewater management plan, I know that there's talk of the outfall and what the capacity would be there, that may shift things even very quickly. We're trying to decide what the best approach is. In some areas, there'll be, as we discussed, and undoubtedly some areas where there'll be a requirement to put in an IA system at new construction. During repairs, that's typically a time when somebody is really hard up against it, and they just need to get the wastewater into the ground or away. So we've discussed things like we do now, is putting on the plan an accommodation for that so that it's engineered and ready to go, the standard system could be put in, and then we're discussing at what trigger would that have to be pulled. For instance, at a real estate transfer in an area where we didn't make them do it when they were hard up against it, and a repair. They only needed to get that repair done. But we realize that that may sit in a very nitrogen-sensitive area that's not going to be sewered. So we need to decide what triggers would cause that to be put in. Real estate transfers seem to be a time when that should happen, or a sunset clause. So we're sort of up against a lot of uncertainty as to how hard to push and how fast. So if you sense from the board that we're not exactly screaming forward and saying, everybody put these things in now, it's somewhere between that and what is reasonable, what is equitable, and what won't break the bank when it shouldn't be broken.
So in the version 4, which is in front of me, which I think is where you've worked to, there's nothing specific in here that says if a system fails, that could be at the time of real estate transfer, an inspection gets done and it doesn't pass or whatever, that they have to upgrade. You haven't yet incorporated that wording in here,
Correct,
That's correct.
but you're considering it.
yes.
Okay. The second one that I would note and comment on is under item 4, the fact that you will not be required to connect to a sewer service area. I don't think you have to put it into your regulation, but I think it needs to be understood that once a sewer service area is defined and the town proceeds forward, the town winds up assessing betterments against all properties for their proportion of that sewer. So homeowners need to understand as they exercise the option of putting in best available because of your regulation about system upgrades or whatever, that they're still going to have to pay the betterment when it shows up. Okay?
Correct. That's what we assume, that's the law as it is
Yeah,
now.
we're filming this and other people are going to see it and whatnot, so
Yeah, and what we would have to do, if you allow through the chair.
go ahead.
What we would have to do is grant a variance, because most of the permits that are issued, even for best available technology, indicate that you have to hook up when sewer becomes available.
Right.
So becomes available, of course, is when it's front end in front of your house. So there would have to be a variance and an extended timeline. We would have to discuss with DEP, and probably in context of your wastewater management plan, what the allowances would be that would forestall that immediate hookup. And, you know, also, of course, we have to talk to folks who are putting the sewer in, because I'm sure the economics of the sewer depend on the betterment. I'm not so sure how the economics work for connections, because connections provide revenue also.
I usually allow people on my board to, go down the line with comments they might have, and then I'm usually willing to open it up to the public if they have comments. So talking to where we're at with a regulation you're looking at and how it fits together. Ken, let's start at your end.
I don't have any substantial thoughts beyond what you're already doing. I mean, I think you're going in the right direction. We've had this power in Title V for a long time, and I'm glad to see it's finally being used. I guess that's what I would say.
Ed?
I think it's outstanding, the work you've done. I think version 4 kind of closes it and brings in everything, including the eventual availability of a sewer, which the only thing that's in the drawing board and approaching time for funding is the task of expansion. Beyond that, we're probably 15 years down the road at best before we're ready to sewer another area and go for funding, because, there is extreme capital costs that have to be raised to fund additional sewering. So task is gonna happen, assuming it passes through town meeting and the general electorate. But then to get to the next phase, we're probably 15 years away from a shovel in the ground at the earliest, and it's dependent too upon the outfall pipe and available capacity for the discharge. So it's a long horizon, and I think your 15-year clause really covers that very well. I had a concern in my reading of this prior to the meeting about the not having failed systems in the trigger. And you've explained that quite well, that, yeah, people are really under that gun if a system's failed and they gotta repair it, otherwise, go down the street to a hotel to use facilities. So I think that makes sense. That answered my concern quite well. I like it. You've covered the increase in flow from substantial improvement, so good job.
Steve?
Thank you for making sure there's always a fire behind us. But I want to clarify one thing. I know that anything we propose has to be approved by the select board and town meeting and possibly town voters. But am I correct that you can do things because you're a regulatory board, even if no one else likes the idea?
Well, we have to have public hearings.
But do you have to listen to them?
If they're reasonable.
I think there's, the first and foremost trigger, as I recall from sitting on the Board of Health, was it has to relate to public health. And Title V is very clearly
Public health of the environment.
public health regulation. So any modification or home rule relative to Title V, I think is covered.
It is covered. It is absolutely true that the Board of Health, after 2 public hearings, can pass regulation despite any objection. We usually don't do that. We listen to it. It gets modified. And in this case, it's far-reaching. It's really far-reaching. So it's kind of new ground. We'd love a vote of confidence from the town through town meeting to say, hey, go for it. But as with, and John Waterbury knows, during the smoking wars, we call them, we had, aside from veiled threats and actual threats, we had to go against public opinion. And there was a lot of people, and there was more heat than light in that room that night. This is going to be something that costs a lot of money for folks. And we would like to see, as a board, some support from the town. Some go ahead, yeah, that's the way we have to go. But also, and I'm sure your board has thought about this, is the equity piece of it. I mean, somebody putting in an innovative alternative septic system for the public good is going to bear the whole cost, whereas once the sewer goes in, the public bears that cost. So at some point, somebody has to look at the financial piece of this, of folks who put in IA systems at a pretty decent expense for the public good, very similar to some sort of subsidy, somewhat like the sewer.
So
Thank you, George.
if I can, I'm going to ask you all to hold the subsidy conversation a little bit, because I have another slide that I want to bring in here to talk a little bit about costs and some monies and whatnot. So let's stay with the regulation.
But George just said 80% of what I was going to say next, if you hadn't said it, that I think we have to solve that financial plan before you create a separate class of people who haven't paid anything, and then we have to create a new class that we have to pay. And I think you sounds like you understand that. The other suggestion I have is more detailed on the threshold for renovations. I researched this today. Falmouth properties range from 400,000 to 24 million. The average is 900,000.
Amazing.
You would not, we were asked before whether we should use whether we thought you should use the assessed value or an appraised value. And I think we all agreed on assessed value. But today I realized there's a third possibility, which is a fixed absolute number, which you can pick, but let's, for purposes of discussion, say 400,000 or 450,000, half of the average value. That way, if you don't do that, the person in a $10 million house can install an indoor swimming pool and 4 bathrooms before he gets to the half price point. Whereas the poor guy hits it right away at 200,000. If you use a fixed absolute value, you solve that problem. Plus, you push it, you pick up a few extra users who can A, really afford it, and B, live close to the water.
I like that a lot. Yeah.
I think it's simple, and you can have all kinds of obvious things for adjusting it for inflation as the time goes by. That's all I want to say.
That's brilliant.
That's what you pay me for.
I know. I'm gonna have to get another cup of coffee this week, huh? John?
I had a couple of suggestions for Jed. If you look at what the variance triggers are that you've got, you said if within 5 years there was going to be, I think it makes a lot more sense to say that when a sewer service area is designed and has been approved and funded.
Yeah.
And the other thing is when we've talked about the major reconstruction.
On his writing, make sure he gets it down before you go
Right,
next.
yep.
Okay. Sorry.
The other thing I would suggest is that when you describe 50% of major reconstruction, that you add at the end, if there is an additional building permit issued within 3 years of that, it automatically triggers the IA going in. That's language and.
Cumulative. Yeah, you don't do a bunch of $50,000
Yeah.
revisions, break up the work into multiple parts to get underneath it.
I stole this paragraph actually from somewhere else in the Falmouth Town Code. I can't remember exactly where, so.
So this leans on the 12-month, a 12.
It's a 12-month, I just
cumulative.
cut and paste, so
Yeah,
we
but
can,
we're talking about 3 years.
we can do a 3-year
instead.
cumulative period, that's fine. That's an easy fix. Going back to Stephen's connection, in terms of a sort of a lower threshold trigger than say 12 million on a, how about something to the effect of 50% of the median sale value in the year, during the year in which the permit is requested?
I'd want to know how much variance there was in that. I mean, you could research that, I just don't know it.
It should be the previous year. 'cause
Previous year?
Yeah.
Previous, yeah, I mean, there's.
Yeah, but it will skew if a $24 million house sells 1 year.
But what's wrong with just
That's
True.
It'll skew.
That's skewed.
picking a number and adjusting it as you go along?
Because I don't want to don't want in a regulation something that we have to adjust every year. I want it to be auto-adjusting, because otherwise, and I don't want to index it to inflation or whatever else, because then which inflation number do you use? And
I'm gonna suggest
So,
that we've made.
we'll do some work on
We've
that.
made a comment, I don't know
No.
that we need to wordsmith.
We'll figure it out.
Wordsmith it right now, but I think.
it's a
I'm getting this
very
head
good
nodding that
selection.
that idea has got some merit.
We'll do some research and figure out what a good index number is.
George, do you want to comment?
No?
Okay,
John?
John's still up.
No, I'm done.
Okay. Tom,
The advantages of going last. Most of the big targets have been beat up, but I've got a couple of fine things here. First of all, it says any structure undergoing substantial improvement. I think it should say any residential structure, because we have barns, we have boathouses, and if you say any structure, then people are gonna be scurrying to try to figure out, right? It should be residential.
What about commercial?
No, commercial
I
too.
want to.
Well, or commercial, right, yes.
I'd like to take a moment here to point out to the Board of Health that Tom is our grammatician, okay? He reviews all of our minutes before we see them in draft form to make sure that we have the right prepositions and
No, it's a
everything.
good point, though. Structure, it could be anything
Yeah,
without a
so-
septic
But-
system.
no, no,
But
it-
put it in a $400,000 barn, you can probably afford an IA.
Oh, I'm sure it's not a matter of
Primary
affordability.
structure.
Yeah, but it's any structure undergoing substantial improvement shall incorporate in a subsurface sewage disposal system. If they don't have a subsurface sewage, if they don't have a septic system, they don't need to use, it's just not a
So
relevant.
you could say something like any structure that requires disposal of wastewater,
Yeah, something along that line.
okay? That way, if somebody wants to,
Primary structure,
Now, let's go a little bit farther into the weeds. The DEP uses impaired to refer to estuaries and uses sensitive to refer to watersheds. And I think you need to, obviously, an NSA is a watershed that drains into an impaired estuary. But they seem to get crossed over back and forth when we have our discussions, because the watershed isn't impaired, it's the receiving body of water that's impaired. And they use the term sensitive to apply to watersheds that drain into a body of water that has a limit on nitrogen inputs. So, it may be a moving target, but I've gone back and read through what I could of the DEP regulations and stuff, and they seem to refer to estuaries as impaired and watersheds as sensitive.
We can add those to the definitions.
Kevin, if I can, what do you think the Board of Health's timetable is? You talked about trying to get your wording down, then holding a public hearing, and then implementing that. Do you see that happening over a 2-month period?
Sorry, two public hearings, and yeah, I think that's a reasonable time frame to consider, unless we run into any serious problems with this decision.
Yeah.
You know, if anybody
You know, I'm
identifies,
not going to hold you to it, but it sounds like sometime in April?
maybe earlier, I would suggest.
Yeah, but, not next fall.
Correct.
Yeah.
I have a question on this, since we have it open.
I was gonna
Let's
suggest
ask.
we do, I like Steve's idea, why don't we go down the line? Start with Amy, if that's all right, Jed?
That's fine.
Well, we definitely have a lot to consider. I guess my general question for water quality is everybody leaning toward version 4 at that point? I mean, we've had serious discussions amongst ourselves between nitrogen-sensitive areas and impaired water bodies. That's been a hot topic. And then to expand out to all of Falmouth, that's another big step that will certainly draw a lot of public attention. Is that where
I
everyone?
like number 4. That's the one as you see, I spent the most
Yeah.
time on.
Well, and that's what we've had the most comments on tonight, so I just want to make sure everyone's capturing that particular critical element of version 4 as opposed to the earlier versions.
I mainly noticed that version 4 had to change the 5 years to the 15 years, which I thought was essential. In fact, if anything, I thought it should go to 30, since you just said the lifetime of 30. And I have to admit, I didn't notice the other differences.
Yeah, it'd be worth summarizing the differences, because it's an important question, what the Water Quality Management Committee. Jed, do you have it all in your head? Can you say what the differences are?
Between version 1 and version 4? There's a,
Key, or, yeah.
the
I mean,
the key, it's up at the top, actually.
Yeah, each one is introduced by a sentence that.
So version 1 is using the nitrogen-sensitive areas as defined in 310 CMR. 5.2 and 4, to be precise. Then I kind of waffled and said nitrogen paired, and
In version 2.
in version 2, to expand it to still areas that have been, intended to areas that have been at some point or another identified or not as impacted.
And we'd have to define.
We might have to define that, yes. Version 3 and version 3 is expanding it, recognizing that all of Falmouth is in fact nitrogen sensitive, and nitrogen in one way or another. And version 4 was adding a credit for the installation of the best available nitrogen reducing technology. I want to note that that item 3 is, in fact, a delay, allows for a delay
Right.
of installation, if a sewer is going to go, if we know a sewer is going by, just so that somebody's not putting some, as George has pointed out, is somebody is not burying a car in their backyard and then abandoning it 5 years later.
Have you estimated the annual rate for the 4 different scenarios? The number that would wind up being required?
I don't know. This is a question for our health agent as to approximately how many systems he approves every year and how many new ones. This was actually going to be a question I had.
For which one?
Well, brand new homes, I would say, you're usually nowadays on a subdivision of a 40B, a lot of new construction, you don't have a lot of loose lots. But when you add the bedroom increase, I would say somewhere around 100 to 150.
Oh, if it was all of Falmouth.
The full
I'm
town.
talking, okay, so my 150 is based on the new bedrooms adding flow, okay?
New construction,
And if you're
which is,
taking all of Falmouth.
All of Falmouth, how many building permits do I look at in a year? Would there be an additional bedroom or something that would increase flow? I sign on about 600 to 650 building permits a year that I look at. I would say a third, a quarter to a third of the 650 would be something that would meet the new construction definition. As far as the substantial, I usually don't look at what the cost of the project is. So I don't know exactly, because I can care less of the cost of the project. I need to know whether it's gonna be, if the septic that's there, the septic they propose equals what's going to occur in the building permit, or if there's any encroachments. That's the main reason why I'm looking at building permits. So then I can tell you maybe a quarter to a third of the building permits that I get would be meeting the new construction definition.
So 150 to 200 if it was all of Falmouth.
It was all of Falmouth. It's just I don't have a good number in my head about the substantial.
Just kind of a rough idea.
It's not
That's only with
less than
increases
50, and
in
it's
flow.
not less than 50, and it's not more than 200. So a
hang
working
on.
number would be
Then-
100.
Then if you cut that down to only the, question A, the impaired areas, and question B, the NSAs, what do you got?
Well, then, take 15, we have 21,000 homes, it's 15,000 in the watershed. What's that percentage?
3/4.
Right.
So
So take the number I just gave you, cut it by 3/4, and that's what it is, but it's just the NSA.
It is.
So, Kevin, you had suggested you would keep going down the board, sort of in order to get comments. I just want to jump in here
I'll
momentarily.
be quiet.
Sure.
No, you don't have to be quiet. The question about all versus nitrogen-sensitive watersheds. Again, we are an advisory board to the selectmen. Our focus is currently on the nitrogen-sensitive areas and this watershed, planning watershed permitting process. So I don't know that we as a committee can say all is the best answer, or all should not be done. But I think from the Board of Health standpoint, as you're looking at this, I don't think, at least I'm not challenging your reasoning for saying all. How's that? I'm not sitting here saying that, but I just want this board to be careful that before we turn around and say, we are all in favor of all, because we don't have the power to say that. Okay? We could have our opinion, but it's not an official position.
Ken raised his hand first.
A couple of thoughts on version 4. First is this issue, item 3. I agree there's some problems there, because it's intended to protect someone who is in a future service area, not one that's been approved and funded. At the same time, how do we know when 5 years is before it's going to happen? There's a third aspect to that. regardless of how good these systems are, they're probably only half as good at best as being sewered. So if too many of the homes in these areas that are designated for sewering put in these denied systems, the loading calculation actually might be off. So we got to be a little careful about that. With respect to all of Falmouth, I think part of the rationale that we had in defining the geoboundaries was that that's a defensible argument. You know, if you're in an area that's contributing to an impaired estuary, contributing nitrogen to an impaired estuary, there's a legal justification for saying you need to improve your wastewater treatment. If you're not, I'm just imagining some homeowner saying, why do I have to do this? I'm going to get a lawyer. And what would the state, how would the state come down on that? That's, you know, what does Title V actually empower you to do with respect to nitrogen limitation in an area where the home is not contributing to a nitrogen impaired system?
Right, and this is some of what we talked about at our last meeting, and the difference between the Water Quality Management Committee charge, which is to identify plans that will handle these areas designated by the state, whereas we're the Falmouth Board of Health, and our mandate is to protect health and environment, right? And the environment very much is and can be impaired by excessive nitrogen loading, even if MEP didn't choose to develop a TMDL for a particular area. So that doesn't bind us. Whatever MEP did and the state designations, we're here to protect the environment and health. It's a different. Did you have something to add to that, Scott?
Well, once you come up with a final draft, the town council will be reviewing it as well.
Yeah, I'd be interested in town council's view
We
on
haven't brought town council because we've kind of done quite a bit of changes on every meeting.
Right.
I don't need her to go around.
No.
keep going.
No,
So
definitely not.
Once something's sorted, then, we'll have town council look at it as well.
Because if you were making direct discharge into Buzzards Bay, for example, or Vineyard Sound where the outfall is, and I was an angry homeowner, got a good attorney, I just feel like it might be hard to defend that.
Have we heard from everybody on your?
No.
No.
So one of the triggers that we've talked about, and is not in any of these versions, is the requirement for an IA to be installed upon property transfer. And this is something that, it did come up in an early, if there is a failed system, or perhaps if a house is in an area defined by the geoboundaries in which an IA would eventually be required. And we haven't included this yet, and it's something that we need to talk about. And part of this is that, we're talking about, having been to some of these meetings, the requirement for an installation of something on the order of 5,000 IA systems. That's a lot of digging. And to even do it over the course of 20 years is still a lot of digging. We're digging these things up in some cases on a sort of semi-regular basis, but spreading it out by starting now rather than in however many years these things will actually start to take effect might be something to consider. And I just, something to perhaps ask for people's opinions on, but we can continue discussing this. So I don't know if anybody has an opinion on this, but you want to recognize.
Just waiting my turn.
Go ahead, George.
Looking at all of the regulations, and we have not had a vote on this or anything in a meeting, but I would agree with Ken on this. Very rarely I do, but only kidding. But there are areas where you could not demonstrate a nitrogen loading to the detriment to the environment in Falmouth. And in any regulation that I've ever had anything to do with, I always, in the back of my mind, come up with those dreadful words that a board can't be, arbitrary and capricious. So when DEP passed and outlined the nitrogen-sensitive areas, I thought, finally, we have a boundary that is defensible, and we don't even have to defend it. They defend it. And so the only thing I struggle with is where in town. I don't think it should be the whole town. I think it should be in areas where we can demonstrate that there will be an impact by the nitrogen. The nitrogen-sensitive areas are certainly a start on that. There are areas that are not impacted now that may be at build-out or excessive building be impacted. I don't know how we're going to define those. You know, you might look at the state list for impaired waters, and you might say, okay, I'll go there. I'll go NSAs and there. And if there was another credible sort of designation by somebody who did the study, and it was sanctioned by a government organization that I can point the finger at, because I love to point fingers back at somebody else, I would say, yeah, we could use that as a boundary. So, I mean, my leaning is toward having something so defensible that I don't care, bring on the lawyer. There's the designation. Here's how it was arrived at. The Board of Health and due diligence is protecting that particular impacted water or could be impaired water. And that's where I go with it. I think that it's very good that we at least, again, I go back to the repair situation. When somebody's hard up against it in a repair, you say, okay, we won't make you do it now, but you will design it in now. And when you reach that point where you're giving up the ghost or your property, or both, then it's going to happen. So that's sort of where I'm at.
A couple of things. First, Steve, I know you want to put off talking about the money, but I don't think we can talk about any of this without talking about the money up front, because if we want to come up with a fair system of paying for all of this, the outflow pipe, the sewers, the septic systems for the community, if we wait until people know which category they're in, and this is going to have to go to, I don't know, you all know more about town government than I do. This bottle knows more about town government regulations than I do. It's going to have to go to town meeting, I guess, or at least to the select board, lots of groups. If everybody, especially if it goes to town meeting or to a vote of the citizens, if they already know which group they're in, it's very hard for them to then make a decision about fairness. So very famous, John Rawls, famous political ethics guy of the 20th century, that these kinds of decisions should be made with a veil of ignorance about which group you're in. So I think we need to solve the fairness and equity of how it's going to be paid for while nobody knows, and unfortunately a lot of people are going to think they know which group they're in. And they should vote on a fair system before they know, as much as we can. And we also can't wait for this 20-year timeline, because one of the things the more experienced George brings up often is we need to figure out what we're going to do in the meantime. What are we going to tell the person who comes with a proposal to the Board of Health next Monday? And how is that going to square with somebody who comes to the Board of Health in 5 years? And what about the person, the family who came 2 years ago? We can't keep changing the rules, but I don't think we can also just say we're going to be bound by for sewerage, the 70-30 split that has been generally done in town, from what I understand. Maybe that's a good way and maybe it isn't. But I don't think there's anything more important than figuring out the equity of the money bit. To my mind, it should be divided up amongst the entire community. Whether you're putting in a sewer or advanced IA, I understand that state laws or regulations would need to be changed for us to, for the community to subsidize somebody putting in an IA system on their property. If that needs to be done, then we should have our state representatives in here to help us figure out how to do that. I don't think there's anything, the difference between these four plans is important, but compared to the equity issue, I think they're small potatoes.
Good point. We'll work on, we'll get through the, sort of the, what do you got, what's your regulation? Then I'm gonna get up here and talk a little bit about equity and financing, okay?
Okay, and the other thing, in terms of these four things, I agree with George and Ken. If you could back up your maps to the ones that showed there were a few areas, I guess because they essentially discharge into either, and also, are we pretty certain we don't have to worry about the ocean? We always think we don't have to worry about the ocean until we say, oh, rats. We should have worried about the ocean. And also phosphates.
Anything else?
That's a lot of yeah.
Anything else? So let me,
Contaminants of emerging concern?
I think we should lower the raise the mean temperature
so I'm
for
gonna,
the next 3 months.
I'm gonna try to
by
answer
15 degrees.
one or two of your questions fairly quickly. Phosphorus is primarily an issue for the ponds. We have,
No, I
from the pond committee, we're not trying to work at odds with them. But that's why I sort of covered how many of these areas are in and how many are out, so we can see how much of the overlap there is. Secondly, we are well into the outfall evaluation, science work, and everything else. And I will tell you that everybody is very, very aware of what we're doing. There's been an ongoing program of sampling the wastewater effluent, as well as sampling in the sound, and comparing all of those things for something called an anti-degradation policy. That's an ongoing exercise. We've had a study done by the USGS as to whether or not an outfall impacts the water supply. So we've got several of those that are evolving and coming out. You can always get a different answer, but right now, from everything that I've been seeing, Amy is gracious enough to allow me to participate in certain outfall meetings she has with the town's consultant on this. We're not getting to the point of going oh my. Okay, I just want to cover that if you got that concern and you raised it.
That wasn't actually what I meant. What I meant was the whole ocean. We never thought we could fill it with plastic, and we have. I have
Okay,
no idea.
I would like to say that Falmouth is not going to take on the whole ocean.
It's a good point, but let's.
So I'm gonna backtrack a little bit, if I can. Where I gotta go this way. So, just to help you, I'm gonna walk through these maps again, because you're asking a good question. This is the map, basically, that the state put out of watersheds. And I put the town boundaries on it. I'm gonna modify that. This is a little bit of an expanded map. This map here doesn't go all the way down to Woods Hole. This is the one with the NSAs on them, and I tried to help out by putting some numbering, so as you guys look at what you want, whether you want to do all or whatever, you're welcome to use this map as you see fit. So for example, B6 and B7 B7 and B8 are great and little simple, you may decide you want to include them, you know, and not necessarily cover the ones that we haven't put a number on, which are all down in Woods Hole or B9, for example, okay? B9 is a direct discharge. Doesn't discharge to a pond, or it doesn't discharge to a small stream or an estuary. The groundwater flow is down and out to Buzzards Bay. So, to the extent you guys want to say it's all or modify a little bit, this may be of some help to you, okay?
Well, I think it might be my turn, and I'll go really, really quick. I'll just say that, George, your point about what is legally defensible is really a strong one. At the same time, I think it was you at our last meeting that mentioned, well, some of these water bodies might not be impaired or, you know, in bad trouble now, but if we don't do something to reduce nitrogen loading during build-out, they will be in 20 years or so. So we have that problem as well. And then building on Ken's comment about a sewered house being at least twice as good as a house with IA system on it in terms of nitrogen loading, I think we just clearly want to sewer a lot more than we want to put in IAs. The third point being that at some point, as we piecemeal add more and more IAs, we're getting towards gonna get towards the point where we need an entity that will manage all of these systems. As it is right now, and for the foreseeable future, they're individual small wastewater treatment plants, and just having them put in isn't good enough. We have to have them well-maintained, and we have to know that they're well-maintained. So more sewering, less IAs.
I would say that the Water Quality Management Committee is very aware of a couple of items that need to be worked through and resolved. You know, the financing, obviously, how can we or how should we pay for things? And then secondly, you know, we had a presentation from the tech centers group on a managed entity, how that might look. We've also had conversations, should the town standardize what type of systems they would like? Should the town be buying those systems and then subsidizing a portion of the cost or all of the cost for those elements? So we don't have a firm recommendation yet, but we are working our way through how those things function and react, okay? This would be the moment, since everybody's had a chance to talk onto the regulation component of it.
I actually have a question. I'm an observation and a question, if I might, on this. I want to note to the Water Quality Management Committee in particular that portions of some of these watersheds, particularly in B8, are already required under state regulations and our regulations to have an IA system installed as a drinking water resource protection zone. So there's a number of those areas that are already required to have IAs and have historical IAs installed in them. So
Maybe you know something I don't know. B8, which is fundamentally
I think B8.
that B8 is where, that is the resource, the town's drinking water supply, okay?
Right.
So, it's not a zone 2, okay?
Part of it is, right?
No, it's actually a S1, a surface water supply 1, and there's a very small area that's defined around the rim of that. The town put in overlay districts a long time ago, and that's what you can find a map that has the same shape as that B8 from a long time ago, done by Mr. Kerfoot, okay? But it's a town regulation, and it requires a subdivision with more than 5 homes, 5 lots to put in advanced treatment, not every location. And if you have a 40B, it does not apply, okay? So we've been through this battle on things that went in the B8 area, okay? So if you've got a different regulation that says
No, no, no.
everybody has to, it's,
No, you're right.
No, ours is only zone twos.
It's only
for
zone
public
twos.
supply.
well, the zone two's for public water, but the town
Right.
put
Right.
watershed overlay districts in there, in the planning document. But they refer to subdivisions with more than 5 lots in them, okay?
Right.
Right. If everybody's had the comment from the board,
Can I make one more technical suggestion? In the regulations that you're planning, you say you're going to use the best available technologies, of which there are 4 from the DEP list. 2 of those that we're particularly interested in, the Nitrex has an approval letter that it must meet 10 milligrams per liter. The nitro system has an approval letter for 11 milligrams per liter. I would suggest that you say, for the purposes of this regulation, that the systems that are installed must meet 10 milligrams per liter and maintain that throughout their lifetime.
Why not say 11 and get some competition?
10 is better.
And then there's only one company. You just said one was 10, one
That's
was 11.
it's irregardless of what the letter says. We're
Yeah.
saying for our purposes,
They must meet,
they must meet 10.
yeah, I get it.
So
and the
it has
town,
to be nitro E.
Steve,
No.
there's some precedent for this, because previously the Board of Health turned around and said that alternative systems, IA systems shall meet a certain number,
12.
which was a lower number than a number of systems approved by the state, and various vendors then modified their systems to make sure that they meet the town's value.
So what standard, though? Where do we get the performance evaluation from?
You mean how do we validate it, verify it?
Yeah,
You get data from the providers have to submit the data.
As do the owners of
Well,
them.
my system performs it too.
Well,
That's
hey,
fine.
Good.
You're the man.
Better naming.
Yeah.
That doesn't seem, that seems like asking the fox.
What does
No,
chicken
the
taste like?
providers are licensed by the state. They're grade 4 operators, and, at some point you have to trust a grade 4
right.
operator or an operator to submit data. It's almost not quite perjury, but it's pretty darn close.
Yeah,
It's fraud.
Okay.
So, where do you start? How much do you audit? And I think responsible management entity that was discussed would have some audit procedure for a certain percentage of the systems.
But that's retrospective, and what this is about is we're telling Frank and Sue, who are putting in a new system, to pick from a list, not, but we may not have, if we don't go by either the manufacturer or the state or somebody, we can't say it's gotta I'm gonna say it's gonna maintain, and then what if it doesn't?
Now, John is suggesting that is what you include in the regulation, I think is what you're saying. So if somebody gets a system that is not on the list that's approved for that, but they are supposed to get it, then that person selling that system, they're gonna go and say, hey, can you reach 12, or 10, or whatever the number is? And if they say, no, we're only approved to 19, then they're gonna go to the next one on the list that more or less guarantees it.
I'm gonna try to cut this conversation,
Yeah,
bring it to, I will say this. In the revised regulations that came out, that we're all living with, they talk about best available control technology with the target of 10, not 11, not 12, not 13. All the work this committee has done has been on the presumption that the system designers, providers, and whatnot are aware that 10 is the goal that has to be reached over time, and that therefore we didn't model it 9 or 12 or 15 for advanced systems, we modeled it 10. So I would advocate 10.
Okay, thank you.
This is a procedural item I need to cover. We usually only meet for 2 hours. So we've got about another 45 minutes to cover what we want to cover before I ask for a motion to adjourn for at least the Water Quality Management Committee. The Board of Health is welcome to stay here all night. So I would like to give an opportunity, if the board members have covered what they need to cover, to let folks in the audience ask questions. And I would say that your questions have to be very specific, or comments very specific to the proposed regulation, not the whole big universe of everything that we're looking at, so.
Not all the oceans?
Is it Vineyard Sound or Nantucket Sound, Tom? Have we answered that yet?
We'll get there later.
Okay. Laura?
And some of us work on lots of the oceans. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Rafferty. I want to thank the Water Quality Committee and the Board of Health for having this really critical discussion. Corin Peterson from the Buzzards Bay Coalition. I think I came up with on the Board of Health discussion that, yes, sewering is the most effective and efficient way to deal with nitrogen. To the extent that the town can optimize sewering across town, it needs to, so long as they're discharging it in an appropriate location, hopefully through an outfall into the sound. Coalition is very much in support of that scenario, and will do what we need to do to help and support the town in that effort. Given the timeline that Mr. Rafferty presented at the beginning of the meeting, it is really clear that the town needs to take action sooner or later, and specifically with new construction. Clearly, the town has a problem with nitrogen pollution. Adding to it with more Title V systems isn't helping the cause. Whether it applies to town-wide or to some reduced scope, I think this is a very helpful figure. But I want to point out that these estuaries became impaired because of the development on septic systems. So just because there are estuaries on this that are currently not impaired or not nitrogen sensitive areas doesn't mean that they won't be in the future, because there was a time in Falmouth history where these were healthy waters, but we're having to re-engineer what we've done in the past. So at a minimum, the coalition supports a Board of Health regulation for new construction in impaired watersheds and nitrogen-sensitive areas. I think that the board is well on its way to coming up with language that might be able to address places like B7 and B8. Town-wide, I think also works. I think it is defensible for the town. I know there's other communities around Buzzards Bay that have applied it town-wide. The Board of Health does have pretty broad powers in order to do so. So that's our comments for the evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Cory. I'm gonna work from the front to the back.
Laurie Harlow Hawk, West Falmouth. The only thing, I'm glad this is a lot of work you guys have been doing, and I'm sorry I have not participated in a lot of the meetings, but I have Concom. One of the items that I think should be looked at a little closer is the substantial construction, the 50%. I think that's kind of arbitrary when you're talking about assessed values. I have many projects I work on. I'm a Title V installer as well. 50% of a lot of houses is not much when you're talking about the structure. They're not assessed much. These $1 million houses, it's the land that's worth a lot of money, not the structures. There are a lot of seasonal homes that it doesn't take much to go trip the 50%. And literally, you can do a kitchen, 4 dormers, re-roof it, re-shingle it, and put a porch on, and you've tripped it. You should be looking at flow, not what you're adding to your house. It's the flow you're adding to the system. So I think you should really think about that one, to not say it's substantial improvement to your home. It should be any increase in the flow in the system. That's what's impacting the system. The estuary is not your porch. The other thing, because I don't want to, giving people only one choice is communistic, in my opinion. To only be with like the nitro. I know it's probably the best system out there. There's going to be more better systems out there. Mm-hmm. And I don't think you should be putting people, they're going to be add-ons. There already are add-ons. I just have an estimate right here. The tank alone for nitro, the tank alone is $29,000. You haven't dug a hole. You haven't called a plumber. You haven't called the electrician. You haven't done anything. You haven't put the leach field in. You've just put a $30,000 bill on somebody. That's a lot of money on a lot of people. And you talk about affordable housing and retired people. It's a burden that you've got to find a financial stream to help this out, because people just aren't going to be able to pull out 30 grand just for a tank. New construction, I have no problem with new construction. You know, they can build it into the cost and figure it out, but for people that are on, you know, that have been living in a house for 30 years, and all of a sudden you're going to say, hey, you got to come up with 30 grand just for a tank? You can't put them in a driveway?
You're varying off the regulation, and you're moving into the
All right, well, you
finances.
can't, just so you know, you can't put the nitro in a driveway. We have all these little teeny lots, and we have conservation areas, and we have Board of Health, you know, limits. So if you can't go near you can't put anything on the water side. It's gotta be on the back side. It's gotta be in a driveway, or, I mean, it's prohibitive. You gotta look at just more than one system. I don't think it's fair to anybody.
Matt? Do we have other hands out there?
Good evening. Matthew Hanley from West Falmouth. I'm also representing Surfrider Foundation. Water quality is very important to us, but so is equality and what is equitable to the people. I also believe that people need choice, and I think along those terms, these IA septic systems are part of that choice. You know, the Water Quality Management Committee and the Board of Health has done a great job identifying emerging technologies. You know, one of our partner organizations, Buzzards Bay Coalition, is actually using the layer cake technology, and Mass Tech is currently testing some of these new emerging technology to knock down not only nitrogen, but also phosphorus for some of our freshwater ponds. On Friday, I'm actually going to go look at one of the Fuji systems with the Falmouth Ponds Coalition, which uses an iron plate to reduce nitrogen.
I'm gonna do this.
So
Like,
I'm
you're
just-
talking about, like, systems.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the regulation, which is focused on
So
when and where
this
people have to do
regulation
this.
is needed. I was going to the meetings 3 years ago when the Board of Health was looking at fast-tracking something very similar. And unfortunately, the state kind of derailed things and mixed everything up, and everything got tossed back into the water quality, and now the Board of Health is working diligently. I really, truly feel the board is trying to find a solution. It's going to be a hard solution, but the Board of Health is working really hard, as the Water Quality Management Committee, to find a solution for the residents of Falmouth. It's going to be unpopular. You know, in my opinion, a lot of this should have been talked about 10 years ago, but the technology wasn't where it is today. And I am in favor of a town-wide, number 4, version 4, with town-wide and with some kind of delay for sewer. That will help people that in good conscience are stepping up at the forefront, installing this technology. And when the sewer comes, yes, they're going to pay the betterment, but they're not going to destroy something they just stuck in the ground 2 years ago, 5 years ago. I was very involved in the sewering for T-Ticket for Mara Vista, and I went to those meetings, and people are like, I just put in an IA septic system. Now you're telling me I have to dig it up and hook up to sewer? So I feel for the people. I listen to the public, and I feel like this is a good start. If we start with number 4, we start this year, then we're edging the people of Falmouth into the reality that something has to be done town-wide. And that if we pick, unfortunately, if we only pick the watersheds that are impaired or sensitive now, some of these large contributing projects like 40B projects are going to pick these other neighborhoods and put in large projects that are going to not have to meet the same standards as the rest of the town. So if we do something to be fair and equitable to the whole town, it needs to be town-wide. And then we will be talking at some point about, you know, financial stuff. So I'll leave that up to you, Steve. Thank you very much.
Chris Neal, you were next.
Hi, Chris Neal, Marvin Circle. So I just want to thank you for going ahead and having these deep discussions about these hard problems, because we need to do both. We need to expand sewering, but we're not going to get there just with sewering. So IAs are an important piece of that. I would echo Corin's comment that, you know, sewer where you can, because the benefits are greater per unit structure that you hook up. But I commend you for this. I just have two things. I favor the townwide approach for the very same reasons that have been already stated, is that all these enclosed waters, if they're not vulnerable now, they will become vulnerable in the future. There's nitrogen in the groundwater that hasn't hit yet, that's still years out, and so we should be thinking about a townwide approach. But the other thing I want to have you consider is that think about the impact on freshwaters. There's a lot of evidence right now, the overwhelming, in fact, for freshwaters, that it's the combination of N and P. We can't say that that N has no effect on freshwaters. It has an effect. P has an effect. Maybe that's slightly bigger than N, but when you put them both together, that effect is gigantic. So keeping N out of fresh water has a public health and environmental benefit, as well as keeping it out of estuaries. And I think that could be used as part of the justification for town-wide, because you look at this map and there are places like our drinking water supply that wouldn't be eligible based on the map of sensitive water. So just please consider that in the way you think about this entire endeavor. Thanks.
Kim, you're up.
Kim Comart from the Falmouth Pond Coalition. Thanks for Chris's comment about P, because it's phosphorus and it's P. That's a lot of the problem. I'm going to just read a quick statement. So the Pond Coalition applauds the decision to bring the Board of Health together with the Water Quality Management Committee as the town develops plans and regulations for addressing the protection of Falmouth's waters through the installation of advanced septic systems. To some extent, Falmouth, like many towns on the Cape, the islands, and elsewhere, is paying the price for decades of underinvestment in protecting our waters from the harmful impacts of fertilizer, surface water runoff, septic system effluent, and other pollutants. As such, wastewater management has become our largest capital expense, and we're facing decades of massive costs as we try to get this problem under control. We all know that freshwater ponds are integrally connected to our larger water system. A significant percentage of the nutrients and pollutants in our freshwater ponds enter the groundwater and flow into our rivers, saltwater ponds, and estuaries before making their way to Vineyard Sound or Buzzards Bay. By protecting our freshwater ponds, we protect those other waters. This meeting is taking place because plans are being formulated to require thousands of property owners to install advanced septic systems over the next 2 to 3 decades. The purpose of those plans is not to satisfy the Department of Environmental Protection. The purpose is to protect our waters and help ensure that they remain healthy for generations to come. If Falmouth fails to consider the protection of freshwater ponds in its wastewater planning, we will undermine our investments in protecting our coastal waters. Again, we applaud your commitment to engage in collaborative thinking and planning. That said, we respectfully recommend that protection of freshwater ponds be considered in this planning process. One way to do that would be to invite the Freshwater Ponds Advisory Committee, a parallel body to the Water Quality Management Committee, to join these discussions. Thanks for your consideration.
Amy Lowell?
Hi, Amy Lowell, wastewater superintendent. I also really appreciate both groups thinking about this. I worry a little bit that the concern about fairness and how these things are paid for in the future would slow this particular regulation. It doesn't seem to me that it has to, in particular because it's talking about, it would primarily affect new construction. And I don't think anybody's concerned about the entire town covering a portion of the cost for IAs for new construction. And the other category affected here is properties doing very significant improvements to their property. So the reason I'm interested in this thing moving forward is the same reason a lot of people are, which is that every new construction that goes in makes it harder, without an IA system, makes it harder for us to meet our TMDLs. We are tasked with meeting the total maximum daily load limits for nitrogen for all our coastal ponds. And there's new development going into these watersheds all the time now that is adding more nitrogen, so adding to the load that the town needs to deal with in its planning. So it's, obviously, that's pretty basic, that's why we're talking about it, but it adds some urgency. I did want to support what John Waterbury said in item 3. I would replace the 5-year number with the Board of Health in the past, for the past sewer project, did not require IA systems or even septic upgrades, I believe is what we were talking about, septic upgrades when the sewer project had been funded. So when the town had voted funding for the construction of the project. And I think, because nobody, even I, don't know about a 5-year time frame, but I know that something's going to happen when the construction's been voted. The last sentence of item 3, I think, is not necessary. When the sewer goes in front of the property, they will be required by the wastewater division, by the town through its wastewater division to connect. And I don't think, if you were going to keep it, 30 days is not realistic. But I don't think you need that line. And I've thought a lot about item 4, and I don't think anything is perfect, but I think this is good. A 15-year time frame to allow people to get the benefit out of the IA system before they'd be required to connect to the sewer. I think that's a good compromise. I also think that it's going to take a while for the town to get to a lot of these areas, even though we plan to sewer a lot more than we have sewered or even have programmed over the next few years. It's going to take a while for us to get there. So I think that's a reasonable compromise. And as I think Steve said, I want to reiterate, properties would still be charged a betterment. They would have to pay a betterment at the time everybody else in the sewer area would be charged a betterment. But what they're being granted under item 4 is a delay in the sewer connection and the cost of that sewer connection. Thank you.
Okay.
Maggie McGaw from Wacoit, and I will be very brief because most of the things that I would say have been said already. Simply, I just want to go on record as a fellow member of the board of the Falmouth Pond Coalition and a member of the Board of Citizens for the Protection of Wacoit Bay. I just strongly approve of this and think that the urgency is enormous to get going, and this will allow the town of Falmouth to begin to make progress on this immediately, and it should make implementation of the watershed plans easier down the line. Thank you very much.
Kristen, do I have a separate slide someplace? Well, Kristen's setting that up. The whole issue of cost and financing is the other Steve on the board likes to use the expression, the elephant in the room. It's more like a herd of elephants in the room, not just one of them. We do not have an answer as to how to do it. We've got an opinion that the town cannot spend money on private property without either a home rule petition or going to town meeting with an article that gets approved by 2/3 of the town meeting and then goes to a vote, because then it makes it a town decision, not a direction. So that's one thing. The other side, and we're just scratching the surface on some of this, is how have other communities managed these costs, or where has the money come from? Whether it's on Long Island, where there's a sales tax that is dedicated to upgrading the systems. Just today, I believe, Amy has pointed us to how maybe a couple of the other Cape communities have found ways to finance. So we're looking at the bigger picture of how do you raise money, how do you finance things. But I did want to talk briefly to the fact that the one thing that is out there right now is a state Department of Revenue tax credit. And the tax credit is associated with having to upgrade your wastewater system upon failure or whatever. And you get, I don't have the numbers in my head, I apologize, but it's some money. It's not as I like to point out, you have to bury a car in the backyard at $30,000 or $40,000 these days to do an advanced system. But it helps to mitigate that somewhat. It's a very limited tax exemption right now. It only applies to owner-occupied principal residences, does not apply to second home rental property. And it's a tax credit that you apply for over several years. John Kaufman is not here tonight, but Steve Layton and John Kaufman crafted a proposal to go to the state legislature and change that so that every homeowner that has to upgrade their system would be able to get that money. So it's in essence begging the state to fund putting advanced systems in, because as this regulation got written the first time through and implemented, the state sort of was clever in not making it a mandated thing where they would have to fund it. They kind of worked their way around through a legislative legerdemain. But we did take that suggestion to the Board of Selectmen. I think 3 meetings ago now, the Board of Selectmen greenlighted us to go out and, pursue that. So, again, Steve Layton and John Kaufman have been putting together an approach, a plan, how to track down through the other communities on the Cape, who to talk to, how to get legislatures Cape-wide lined up in favor of that plan. And I'd say we've got, a solid year's worth of year and a half's worth of work to change that particular element. But it seems like, again, coming back to the fairness, if you're being told to do it, whether you're a principal homeowner or it's a second homeowner, it's still a cost to you. You're paying taxes in the town, you should be able to get that benefit. But I did want to cover briefly with this table, we had that timeline before. The Board of Health is indicating that before the summer, they're likely to have their regulation in place. It's going to be some time before we can change the tax credit, and it could be some time before we get to watershed plans. So, right now, with the limited availability of the tax credit, if you're an owner-occupied principal residence and it's new construction, it's not deemed a failure, so you can't get that tax credit. If you have to do substantial improvements to your property, it's within an NSA, and the Board of Health has told you you've got to upgrade it. We think it's possibly eligible for that money. We would probably have to get a reading from the Department of Revenue, but the last time we asked, we got a pretty responsible reading back from them. If it's a substantial improvement, it's not within an NSA, it's not going to be eligible because it doesn't meet the definition of the way that's set up. If it's a failed system, whether it's in the NSA or a non-SAA, I believe the way that's written, that money's available as a tax credit. And if it's a required upgrade by a watershed permit, which again is down the road a ways, that would be eligible for that amount there. And currently, as I pointed out, second home rental property, non-residents, they're not eligible for that tax credit. So I've said that we have a limited amount of time to talk to finances and fairness. It's something we are working on. The town has had a model of the 70-30 on the sewer side. We're hoping that over time we can revise this limitation. I put my hand on the third rail, I think at one of the last water quality meetings where I said, you know, ultimately to do this, we may need some form of a Proposition 2.5 override or a targeted fund of some sort. And I don't have a lot more to say other than acknowledging that there's many elephants in the room and we don't know how to herd them.
Steve, can I ask you to make one point, is the
You
cost?
make it for me.
Well, the cost difference between a sewer connection, which is pretty standardized between homes, and putting in an IA system, which can vary quite a bit, depending on the property. And if you can elaborate, maybe. Because I think that's what makes it more complicated to figure out how do you help people putting in IA.
Sure. So the town has the 70/30, which leads to the betterment assessment, but that's for the cost of the sewer in the road. Then individual homeowners have to hook up to the sewer from their property line to their house. And last time around, Amy, I think the numbers range between 10,000 and 18,000. Is that a reasonable range?
The range is bigger, but perhaps the average isn't.
Yeah, there were a few outliers at the high end and a couple at the low end, but that cost to connect to your house under this tax credit eligibility, you can take advantage of that tax credit. So that helps you. But you make a good point, Ken. There's work to be done in terms of putting together a massive matrix or table about where all the costs are and everything.
If I might, actually. The cost to putting in an IA system is more or less the cost of the IA technology itself, because we are already requiring the design to include an IA, the positioning of an IA, and so there is some moderately more excavation and then the installation of a tank and a little bit more piping. So
New construction.
no, if you were replacing a septic system, you have to put in a septic system anyway, a standard Title V. Adding in the IA part of it will cost, most of the cost will be the IA technology and a little extra piping.
Okay. Scott is waving his hand furiously.
Well, the cost of a septic system varies on a lot of things, like
Right.
soil conditions, and you got groundwater, so a septic system could cost
Whatever.
$50,000 to $100,000.
Right.
Not counting the IA. So the variability is huge. Can you keep what you have? Do you have a leach field that will work? If your septic 10 years old or 72 years old? Now we can have some 72, probably your old septic's will still run it.
Those are cesspools.
Yes, they'll automatically have to be upgraded. But if you have a 10-year leach field, then you might be able to get away with it. So the
Right.
cost variety is gonna be huge about what each homeowner's gonna have to put in order to get that.
Well, but my point was that the additional cost of an IA system is primarily in that components. If you have to do a septic system, a Title V, the difference between putting a standard one and one that denitrifies is most of that cost is
think
just the IA.
You're right about the components. The problem is the installation cost, which is more variable than the connection cost to sewer or the cost per house of a sewer project.
Ken, I'm going to try to control the conversation a little bit, okay? Tom had his hand up next.
Yes. Another fine point, this tax credit maxes out at 40% of the design and installation
Correct, I
cost.
should have said that, thank you, Tom.
Yeah, that's a
Yeah,
very
it's
important
not,
point.
it's not
only
100%.
40%.
Yeah, you get 40% of your cost back. Ed?
That's incorrect. It's 60% of the cost, up to a maximum of $18,000. The state just recently, in the past 2 years, I think, raised the amount. So the tax credit is for up to $18,000 or 60% of your cost. To Jed's point, yes, the differential in new construction, Title V versus an IA, is the cost of the IA box. The quoted figure that we got from Nitro was $22,500 for the Nitro box. That was a quoted figure. I see you're shaking your head, Maureen, but that's what they gave us for a figure, $22,500. Now, that figure, some towns are looking at subsidies and are saying, look, we'll give, let's use the Falmouth number, 30% of the cost of the IA module, period. So 30, in the 6,000 range. If you're connecting to the sewer, just to put it in, and I did this, so I speak from having used the tax credit. The tax credit is, you're not eligible for your betterment. Betterments do not qualify. It is purely for the work upon your property. And at the time, I used the whole tax credit because I had a 150-foot trench, 8 feet deep and 8 feet wide to hook to the sewer. It was very expensive, and I had to scrap a Title V that I had put in about 7 years before. So towns are doing this different. Some are doing no subsidy. Mashpee already has a mandate with no subsidy. Tisbury has one with some limited number of subsidies. It's all over the place. The cost can be astronomical to a town when Falmouth might be looking at, we came up with, I think, 7,000 IAs if we just went to the geo boundaries. If you go to town-wide, you're roughly gonna double that, if not more. And depending on how you figure what subsidy you give, that number will explode the town budget for the next 50 years. So there's a lot to consider in that, and I think at this juncture, start eating the elephant a bite at a time. Do the new construction, substantial improvement, I am in favor of, for a lot of the reasons that were given. Do it town-wide. I think it's defensible under the state laws, and our friend from BBC said other towns are doing exactly that. So, and the state, in effect, subsidizes on private property with taxpayer funds by granting a tax credit for work on your property. I don't think it's an issue, so I'll differ with some of the attorneys. Other towns are doing it. I think we got to move forward. We got to start addressing the problem of our messed up estuaries. The longer we wait, the worse it gets. And I'd like to live long enough to see some of these estuaries improve. Thank you.
Does Steve or anyone, is there a sense for this statement under the bottom, you have to have the tax liability in order to use it? Do most people?
So what that means is, let's say you're making $60,000 a year, because it's basically a retirement income. You might not be paying much in the way of a state tax.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you're paying $300 or $400 a year. So going back to Ed, because Ed has got Ed keeps track of these numbers for me. It's 60% up to a maximum of
$18,000 over a 5-year period.
5 years. So
now,
3 times. So if your tax or your state tax is only $300,
Yeah.
5 years, 300, that's $1,500 you'll get back.
So it's a regressive.
So that's what the bottom line means, must meet
Yeah.
tax liability requirements,
It's a
okay?
pretty substantial limitation then.
It sounds good the first time, it sounds good the first time you read it.
Yeah.
And then when you look at what it really is doing, so that's why this board went to the selectmen and said, we'd like to start in to see if we can turn this around to be more of a real subsidy for all homeowners that have to do this.
Okay, thanks.
Steve, can I?
Yeah, John, you're up.
Just to put things in a little
Got
bit
you next.
historical perspective, a number of years ago, and I'm not sure, when we hired Wright Pierce to do a comprehensive wastewater plan for Oyster Pond. And the conclusion of that was roughly, if discharge was available, which it wasn't at that point, which we're proposing to solve with an outfall, the cost of an IA and a sewer connection were comparable.
Yeah.
Now, that was a number of years ago. I think that's an exercise which we're going to need to look at critically again in today's dollars.
Right? Jed, I guess you get to recognize
That's
your
all right,
opinion.
go ahead.
Still on a cost question, but now on the management of them and the responsible management entity, are there thoughts on, for example, using the county or some other government agency as an
We should get you a
RMA?
copy. We got a presentation
Okay.
around this, Jed, that we'll get you a copy of it.
Okay.
The issue becomes that A lot of that is kind of conceptual right now, not actual. It was referenced that that the county is doing, I think they said they had 2 locations where they were, quote, the responsible management entity. George, you might be able to help. I think one of them was the West Falmouth
One
program.
Wellfleet to
So like,
town of Wellfleet.
25 or 30 units, and then down in Wellfleet, I think is another 40 or 50. So the scaling that up to 6,000 or 7,000 or 8,000
But
is going to take some thought.
Yes, but while you're working with the legislators in terms of funding, it could be an avenue to explore for funneling state money to the county to alleviate essentially the additional operating costs of running all of these.
Okay.
So just a thought, just for future.
Dr. George?
A question for Amy. When talking about, instead of saying 5 years, to say when the sewer's funded, what's the time lag roughly between when planning for a sewer is funded versus construction of the sewer is funded? And which do you think should be the threshold?
The amount of time between planning and construction funding varies enormously has varied enormously over time. And so that's why and once the construction is funded, it is a very limited amount of time. Say 3 years before the sewer is available.
Yeah, the town has so far traditionally appropriated money for the planning and design. But until you go back to town meeting and you get the money to actually do construction, you don't know when it'll be finished. But once the money's appropriated for construction, 3 years, I think, is a good number. Please. Please. You sat down quick, you could have stayed
Well,
there.
I was asked a question, now I'm asking a question. The question is, I can't tell if these two committees, boards are talking about the subsidy, reimbursement, all that. Do you think that that's relevant to the regulation that you're now discussing? Do you think that subsidies and the fairness question about cost, is that relevant to this regulation which applies to new construction and substantial
I'm going to jump in here. I put this chart up specifically to point out that this regulation is going to go into effect, and the only thing that's out there that any homeowner who's being told under this regulation to put an IA in has available to him at this time is this. So there will be a subset of that ultimate multiple thousands that's going to do something, and then later there'll be possibly subsidies available. But I'm not sitting here suggesting that we retroactively make money available to people who have to do things under this regulation.
Okay, it was sounding to me like you felt like those questions had to be answered before this regulation could be passed. And it sounds like you're saying, no, it does not.
At least one of us thinks that.
No, and I think Dr. George agreed with that, too. For the reasons that Steve just said, but what you said is very relevant, too. With new construction, the thought is that these people are swimming in money at the time of new construction. No, I think that was some of the thinking. And that the cost of the IA is tiny compared to the cost of the new house. So why not make them do it, get a head start for all the reasons that many people gave, at no cost to the town or to the other taxpayers. But as Steve just pointed out, it's more complicated than that, because then you create two classes of homeowners. And this, but I don't want to get too deep into the woods, but there's the problem that's affected urine diversion, and there's this 10 taxpayer law, that in principle, 10 taxpayers can sue a town for spending money on private property. And if, once you create two groups that you're making different, it sort of looks, it makes that more likely. But I'm just saying, I see both sides of it. I think it's complicated.
Go ahead, Amy.
And I would just say that I think it's a question that we need to have an answer for public hearings. I think that people are gonna stand up and say, if I put my development project forth right now, I fund this 100%. If I wait 5 years and I'm captured in a watershed, then I'm,
Yeah, but I'm gonna offer this. We have no assurance right now that we'll either, A, be able to get the state tax code changed. I mean, it's not a given. It's a very much of an uphill battle. And secondly, I'm not sure that we're gonna ever get to the point where the town of Falmouth is subsidizing things on private property. So to not do anything, waiting to find out how subsidies will or will not work, I think there are, as Corin pointed out, there's other communities that have adopted a regulation, much like you're looking at, and have gone forward.
I just want to add
Forward.
to Stephen, what you said about swimming in money. The other logic is if someone is doing something in which they have to touch their septic system for any reason, then putting in the IA then is the most economical time to do it, right? So you're doing construction, or if you're upgrading the system, you're adding flow, that sort of thing, then it's just the least cost.
We have 2 more minutes before this meeting ends. I would like to give a quick opportunity. There's somebody in the audience that has got a 1-minute, very pointed thing to the financing thing. I'll recognize you, otherwise this is not the last time we're gonna be talking financing. I'll assure you of that. I wanna thank everybody for making the time to come out. I wanna thank anybody that's watching this on TV.
Still have a question to the board.
No, our board welcomes feedback and input. I believe the Board of Health does as well. We're getting there.
Steve, we have one burning question.
Okay, so I need to revise this. I have a lot of notes, but there are a couple of questions that were raised by public comment that need addressing in order for me to revise this for the Board of Health. I'm going to revise the purpose because it sounds like the consensus of this board initially is that it should apply to all of Falmouth. And the purpose was pointed out that it should be to protect the environment. That is our mission, is not merely to respond to the DEP. It was pointed out that nitrogen is a pollutant not only for saltwater but also for freshwater, particularly in light of increasing cyanotoxin blooms. I think that's important. One of the concerns was raised as to the definition of improvement, substantial improvement, as to whether it should be the value of the structure or the value of the property.
Or increase in flow.
Or just, which is new construction. That's not, so new construction is captured, any new flow is captured in one, but we're seeing substantial improvement was one of the things that we did discuss.
And we talked about 450K.
So Jen, if I could just pause you.
Yep.
I think we should incorporate Stephen Leighton's comment about a fixed number in the range of, say, 400,000, which I think would partly address the issue about a front porch triggering.
Board of Health, it's about the nitrogen flow. It's the effluent. It's not what your structure is.
But we're still managing the nitrogen if we have someone put in an IA while they're doing a $400,000 upgrade to their home.
But what you're saying is, if, all right, I want to fix my house up and I'm not making any more flow to the septic, all I'm doing is putting on a sunroom or a swimming pool or whatever, and it trips the 50%. I have not added any more nitrogen. Now, if I want to put.
Understood,
No,
understood.
the thought is, before you do anything, you're already part of the problem. Like we all are. We're all putting out nitrogen now, and phosphorus. a huge amount of which has to be gotten rid of within complicated cost constraints. If you have $400,000 to put a front porch on, we want you to take $40,000 and put in an IA too. You're no longer poor if you're putting on a $400,000 front porch.
I'm gonna do this because we've reached, there's gonna be public hearings on the actual
will.
regulation. I think your concerns your concerns have been heard. They're gonna do another draft. I imagine there'll be more than one more draft on it.
So go ahead,
400,000
Jack.
is an arbitrary number right now. We need to wrestle our way to a number that makes some sense.
And then, does the board wish me to incorporate something on an IA trigger upon property transfer? Or shall we reserve that for a future amendment?
We talked about that being challenging within families too.
Yep.
What constitutes a transfer and
Yep.
is there a dollar amount?
Right.
Right, so I think that's a bigger discussion
Okay.
than this one moment.
Great.
That's fine. Then we'll reserve that for a separate draft.
For the next, one of the things you said, but I've never seen written, was that regarding 4 and the time delay, that if you're doing it because of this regulation, or you just are doing, you said if you're having to do a new system because of this regulation. What if you're having to do a new system not because of this regulation?
Because you have a failed system or?
Whatever.
If you have it, but if you're putting it in, then we're giving you credit for having put it in. Because you are spending the money, whether we compel you or not. You're spending the money to protect the environment.
I think we have pretty good start on it, so let's pick it up at the next meeting.
I'll entertain a motion from my board.
Second.
Motion made and seconded, not a discussion.
Second.
Is there a
discussable
second?
motion.
All in favor?
All's in favor?
A standing vote.